It is Thursday, May 22nd, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is Wallace Smith, and I am afraid that my co-host today, Mr. John Robinson, well, I can't say today because he's not actually here today. He is out of the office, so you have just me to be here with you. Hopefully that'll do just fine. I am excited about the topic we're going to be talking about. In fact, I just did a telecast on this topic, taking a look at a certain mindset that our society today is virtually forcing into our minds. I know that sounds aggressive. I will get to that. But how it is countered by the attitude Jesus Christ wants us to have. And it has to do with embracing a particular point of view. That point of view, I think, could be wrapped up pretty well in the statement, you do not belong to you. We'll talk about what that means here in just a moment. It is entirely possible that our generation today is the single most self-centered generation in all of human history. I know that sounds radical, but we're certainly experiencing the fruit of that kind of attitude. And the antidote is a realization of what Jesus Christ longs for us to embrace. And that is the fact that you do not belong to you. Let's talk about it. Welcome again to the podcast. I am Wallace Smith, executive editor of Tomorrow's World magazine. My co-host is out of town this week, so look forward to seeing him again next week and for y'all to hear from him as well. I know that was a radical statement that I made there in the introduction, the idea that this truly might be the single most self-centered generation in all of human history, and I'll throw myself in there as well. I'm not trying to point fingers. We're talking about what I do think is an objective fact, but let me justify that a bit. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Boyer, for that intro music. And hello, everyone. Welcome again to the podcast. I do wish my partner was here, Mr. John Robinson, but I hope he is having a wonderful time wherever he is and look forward to hearing from him again whenever he is back. So let me start off by making what I do think is perhaps an extreme statement. I think it's extreme. Now, let me say this. If it doesn't sound extreme, then that itself is a sign that it's probably true. Like if you're going to nod your head and say, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, then hey, that's great. If not, though, don't worry. I do plan on trying to justify that. Here's the statement. I believe this is the single most self-centered generation in human history. Now, let me justify that a little bit. First, when I say self-centered generation, when I say the word generation, I'm not just talking about, say, Gen Z or millennials or whatever the case might be. I'm not talking about that. I mean the people who are alive right now, the people on planet Earth. And I definitely don't mean every single person, because as we're going to talk about it, I don't think everyone has the same kind of access to the stuff I'm going to talk about. However, I will say that even though I'm talking about multiple age groups, if you will, the young among us do bear the greater burden because they've been surrounded by so many of these reinforcing elements more than the rest of us. However, I have to lump myself in that as well. I definitely feel the pulls of this kind of attitude that I am going to talk about today. So why would I say that? Why would I say that this generation, those alive now, may be the single most self-centered in human history? I mean, think about it. We could reflect on, let's just go straight to stereotypes and think of the ancient stereotype of the Romans with just all the bacchanals, if you will, the kind of behavior where it's all, grapes being fed to emperors and just, terrible parties going on and a lot of self-centered horribleness. You think, are you saying that we're beating out the, are you saying we're beating out the ancient Romans? Are you saying we're with all that hedonistic behavior? Well, one, I am talking about more broadly, and I'm not just talking about hedonistic behavior. I'm not even necessarily saying the most sinful. What I'm saying is the most self-centered, that is the most focused on self. And that is what I am trying to get across. This is what I believe to be the case. And I think it's important to recognize that for what it is and to recognize why that might be the case and why perhaps it's worse for us than other generations. So we can then look at just how radical Jesus Christ's own solution is, because his attitude completely shatters that mindset and actually is a pretty radical recommendation itself. So in terms of the attitude in our society today, let's just think of a few things. Where do we start? I actually did a telecast about this earlier today, and so it's still on my mind, so I'm excited to be able to talk about it. What is different about our society today? Let's consider just to pick one thing. It might be obvious to you that I would go this direction. Let's look at social media. Consider social media. What's going on with social media? I don't care which form you're thinking of. Let's say Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or TikTok or I can't bring myself to call it X, but X, which I still call Twitter. I freely admit I still call it Twitter. X sounds weird. In fact, when you make a tweet on Twitter, you tweet. What do you call it? Do you just call it a post? Just like you call anything else? Okay, that's enough. That's enough grousing. Look at social media. What has it done? Well, it's on multiple levels. It is training our brains to focus on ourselves. First, just the mere fact that you can go to something that is tailored to you. Like when I go to YouTube, as we say on this telecast that I just recorded, there's a reason they call it YouTube. It's definitely not us tube or, hey, our friends, family, and culture tube. It's YouTube. Used to be the sense of it was because it would have videos that you made. That is, you are creating the content. But really, more and more, it's about what you want to see. The algorithm has paid attention to you. Mr. Robinson and I will often talk about the videos being fed to us on YouTube, and the algorithms get very good. They know what you're looking for. They know what you want, and they feed that. And you have directly the fact that you're being fed things trained on you. But even more than that, what is the subtle message of all of these things? What's the subtle message of YouTube? It's that the content you want to see is the only content you should have to see, right? Why should you have to see something you don't want to see? I can go back, and I'm sure many of our listeners surely can think back to a time. Some of you, I know you can't, and I know this, you've probably heard it before. It might seem a little mind-blowing, but there was a time when, at least in the United States, we only had really, say, 3 main channels or so. They had some odd channels that were further down the dial. We called them a dial because there was a disc thing that we would turn on our TV to choose this channel. But you had just a few channels, and yeah, you felt like you had choice. Those channels competed with each other for your attention, but it wasn't much. If you had 100 people sitting in their homes watching television, there's a good chance that a lot of people were watching exactly the same thing you were, because that's all that was on at that time. And then cable came along, and cable television gave us so many choices. The vast majority of it garbage, but still channels upon channels upon channels. And the odds that you were watching something other people were watching was reduced. It wasn't gone, especially for big event television, but it was vastly reduced. And it gave you the chance to tailor even more your entertainment to what you wanted. Well, now look at what we do today. We have streaming networks. I can't even guarantee what streaming things you might have on your television/computer. We have certain streaming channels. And then even those streaming channels, people aren't watching the same thing at the same time. We pick from this vast library what we want to watch exactly when we watch it. Even in those ways, we're being subtly programmed that what you want is most important, to the point that if you couldn't actually pick what you want, you'd probably start to be a little bit frustrated. But let alone pile onto that the algorithms that are learning about you, that are feeding off of you and learning exactly the little details. Write that down, 8:35. 8:35. Announcement. Okay. They're learning all the little subtleties about you that they can to feed you exactly what you want. Now, you might say, and I've heard some say, man, I can't stand my such and such feed, say Facebook feed or this or that, because it just doesn't give me what I want. Well, I would argue that perhaps it does, because it's if you've been on it long enough, it is learning about you, and what it knows is what keeps your thumb moving, what you decide to linger on. Even if you really look at how they do these things, even if you don't actually tap on a video, but you allow it to run for just a few seconds. You pause there to see it. The algorithms know. We actually, for the sake of profit and advertising, we have created systems that not only are feeding us exactly what we want, but they're reinforcing that mindset. They're actually training us, frankly, to be that much more self-centered, as if we are the centers of the universe. Going back to YouTube, if I were to go look at my feed on YouTube, it's feeding me a lot of things based on what I've already seen. What's the end result of that? It's a feedback loop that convinces us all the more that our own ideas are right. The things that we like are right. The ideas that we hold are right. Our stands, our positions, our judgments are right. Why? Because it senses what we've done, and it keeps throwing that at us. Rarely does it really say, well, we need a broadened mind, right? In fact, we would distrust that if that were the case, because who's deciding that we need a broadened mind? Is it the government? What does the government think that I want? So I'm not saying that we need algorithms to then try to decide to broaden our minds, because we don't know, who would actually be making that kind of judgment. So that's all just social media, but there's so much more, right? I mean, forget social media and that level of entertainment. Think of other things. I'm married and don't use a dating app. And frankly, I hope everyone in our audience isn't using some kind of dating app. Get to know actual people. Talk to them face to face. Do dating like you're actually supposed to treat people like humans and not machines. But if you do look at those dating apps, I've seen how they work. You get a face, you get a little bit of profile, and then you're swiping left and swiping right to just kind of decide instantly whether that's someone that you want to say, we'll just say, get to know better. I look at the kinds of mottos that you see here and there. You've got the extreme things where you have a culture that is telling people you can choose your own gender. You just decide, are you a man or are you a woman? How do you know? Well, listen to yourself. Which honestly, even if you were to accept some of those things that, well, someone is a woman who inwardly feels like a woman. Well, just step aside from our main point today and think of how irrational that is. Let's say I'm a young person. How do I know if I feel like a woman if you can't tell me what a woman is, right? What they don't want to say is, oh, well, do you like to dress up in dresses? What they don't want to say is, do you really embrace all the stereotypical things related to women, because they don't want to embrace any stereotypes. But instead, you've got to decide if your inward voice is that of a woman, and somehow you're just going to know, even though we can't tell you what a woman is. So anyway, just setting aside that insanity, it's still so incredibly self-centered. It's about the service of the will, the self-will. Consider some of the other things. The idea you need to be true to yourself. Like there's no greater crime than failing to be true to yourself or living your truth. You've got to live your truth or be authentic. Like somehow being authentic, which doesn't just simply mean being honest. It's nice if that were the case, actually being honest. Authentic used to mean more like that, but no, there's more of a self-centeredness about the idea of being authentic anymore, as if you just be you, even if the you that you're going to be needs work. It's like, well, it's okay. I'm still being authentic. I'm speaking my mind. It is completely backwards from the way Jesus Christ is bringing us to, even though we'll come to that in a second. I want to mention on some headlines I've seen before. This article, I keep going back to it every once in a while because I just can't believe what I've read when I do read it. I remember seeing it in the New York Times. It was titled, "I've Picked My Job Over My Kids." And it is by a woman, in this case, who is essentially it's being presented as a virtue that I had, if you will, the courage to pick my job over my kids. And she goes and talks about that. And she talks about how, well, it's, in fact, if I recall from the article, she is I think a defense lawyer in terms of helping people not go to prison. And she talks about how, she needs to do this. Well, let me just give my own personal story just related to that. I remember when I was an actuary. I used to be an actuary. It's essentially a math person for insurance companies, if you want a short, quick definition. And I remember, no, sorry, it's before that. I've told this story before. Sorry, it's back when I was a teacher, a math teacher. I don't think I need to define that for you. And I loved my job. I loved working with teenagers, and I love teaching math. Honestly, it's my second favorite subject to talk about. So I love talking about math, and I love teaching it to kids. And we had to face the fact that we were having a baby. Finally, we were excited about that, and I had to face the fact that I just couldn't afford to do our plans, which was for my wife to be able to be a work-at-home mom on the salary I was making as a teacher. And some of the best advice I have ever heard in my life was given to me about that when I was struggling about how to be a teacher and do that. And the individual said, "Hey, you know what? someone else can teach those kids in your classroom, only you will be able to be a father to your son. We knew it was going to be a boy by then. And that was exactly what I needed to hear. And that's kind of what I want to tell the mom in this article is, you know what? There are other defense attorneys out there. There are other people that actually have degrees that can do that. No one else can be a parent to your children like you can. There's a similar one that I saw on a different website. I put my career before my family, and it's just kind of put out there like it's a wonderful thing. We're publishing articles like this as if we're somehow celebrating virtues. How many times have I seen children being spoken of? In fact, even in one of these articles, if I recall, how someone said, look, my children truly fulfill me. Well, that's wonderful, but that's not the purpose of children, right? Children aren't something that we gather to ourselves because they fulfill us. Our culture is remarkably self-centered, and we've literally created machines. We've created programs around us that help us to be more self-centered. In fact, if we stop thinking of ourselves for a while, next thing you know, there's a commercial, there's an ad or something that reminds you, have you really thought about you yet? Because here's something you might want. So I would say yes, given the society we've created, we might be more selfish than the ancient Romans. We might be more selfish than any hedonistic culture you happen to pick in the past, at least on a broad scale. And we're suffering from it. If you look at, for instance, and these are statistics for the United States that I was able to access. But you take a look at depression, that is the actual diagnosable depression, and you'll see a steady growth over the last decade or so of people who seem to have depression. That book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, I mentioned this actually in the telecast I recorded today. He notes that suicide rates amongst boys and adolescent boys has grown 91% since 2010. Over the last 15 years or so, 91%. And for girls, it's 167%. Why is that? Well, Haidt highlights the introduction of the smartphone. That is, if you look as the smartphone came to be spread more broadly, you start to see this very consistent upward trend of this. And what is the smartphone? It really is self-entertainment, self-focus boiled down where you have the entire world in the palm of your hand. So I honestly think Haidt makes a good point. I do not think that it is a coincidence. But that said, what is the antidote to all of this biblically? That's what our podcast is about, trying to think biblically about these things. Well, the antidote to that is, frankly, the mind of Jesus Christ. That is the way Jesus Christ lived and thought and taught and wanted us to. We see it in his teachings. We see it in the teachings of the first century church. For instance, actually, during his ministry, during the 3.5 years as he was walking the earth before his crucifixion, you can see something he said in Mark chapter 8. In Mark chapter 8, and let's start in verse 34. He says very plainly, he calls the people to himself, it says, his disciples also, and he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. This idea that if you focus on yourself, you're going to find that you lose what you were focusing on. But if you'll actually let go of yourself a bit, and if you will actually follow me, you will save your life. It's easy to think there that he's simply talking about things like allowing yourself to be sacrificed or to be martyred, but he's not. Losing your life, yeah, sure, if you die, you've lost your life. But losing your life in this sense is not clinging to all the things that are your desires and making them first in your life, making fulfilling yourself first in your life. It's a matter of actually letting that go. And honestly, it does feel like losing your life a little bit, to let go of some of the things that matter most to you and to embrace rather what God has for you. Because this message that I feel it can be boiled down to this in terms of not all of Jesus' message, but this element we're highlighting today is that you do not belong to you. You're not allowed to treat your life, to prioritize everything in your life as if you really are the only thing that matters. You have to recognize you belong to God. You belong to Jesus Christ. You belong to them. You belong to your Creator, and you belong to your Savior. And when you recognize that, then suddenly it's not your priorities that ought to be first. And you might actually think of it as, well, let me just read at least one more verse here before we move on to make sure that is really explicit. You might think it was implicit in what I just said there, but let me read from 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, it's a passage where Paul is talking to the brethren there in Corinth about sexual morals, if you will. They were things they didn't need to be doing. He's trying to highlight that, whenever you sin sexually like that, you sin against your own body? Right? That's not the way it was designed. That's not what it was for. And he makes this point, and I'm going to read it actually out of the Revised Standard Version. He says here, "Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." That's the most blatant version of what I'm trying to say today that I think I can find in Scripture. You are not your own. You do not belong to you. You have been purchased via the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And it might seem like, well, I don't know how you react to something like that. The idea that, what do you mean I don't belong to myself? Well, I would say, I hope we can start to learn that it's very freeing. It's a burden being at the center of the universe, right? I used to highlight this at the youth camp that I used to have the privilege of running for preteens. And I used to highlight to the staff. I used to say, what is the center of this camp? Is it the campers? Well, no, the campers are the reason we're here, right? We're here to serve them, to be sure, but they are not the center of the camp, as odd as that might sound. Now, we're certainly not the center of the camp. The center of the camp has to be God the Father and Jesus Christ. They have to be the center. And here's what I kind of meant from that. If you think of the solar system, I'm a science guy, I like the solar system. Well, the solar system would not be the solar system if it were not for the sun. That is sort of the, I guess that's the center, that's the solar of the solar system. If it were not for the sun there, right there in the middle, in the center of the solar system, there'd be no solar system. Everything would just start flinging apart. Everything would start going its own way in the universe. Their gravity would interact for a while, but it would be a chaotic mess. And next thing you know, we wouldn't have a solar system anymore. We need something massive at the center of the solar system to guide everything, to keep it all together. And the sun serves that purpose. Well, that's the same thing that God and Jesus Christ serve for us. They have to be the center. It definitely can't be us. And personally, this is a little pop psychology on my part. I think that part of the challenge of our society today, part of the weight that the young feel that our society has crafted, is every voice around them is essentially telling them, you are the center of the universe. You're the center of everything. You're the center of education. What do you want to learn? You're the center of careers. What do you want to do for your whole life? You're the center of entertainment. What do you want to listen to? What do you want to read if you still read? What videos do you want to watch? What music do you want to listen to? And that is a burden. It is hard to be the center of everything. And the good news is that we were never meant to be the center of everything. God is the center of everything. Jesus Christ, our Savior, is the center of everything. Another passage I really like about this, I just a touch of drama in it, in Romans chapter 14, verses 7 and 8. Paul says, "For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's." That is you not belonging to you. I had to look it up just a second ago because I did want to get it wrong. You want to be quoting poetry and sounding very erudite and come up with the wrong person. But there's a poem I really like by it's a popular famous poem by Yeats, William Butler Yeats, titled "The Second Coming," and it's not just about Christ's second coming. It's actually not. It's got a lot meaning packed in there. So I'm not. It's difficult for a guy like me that talks about the actual second coming to refer to a poem like that and to have you think that's all it's about. But there's a great statement, a great turn of phrase in that that I think he's really talking about the UK and certain situations there in a society. But it's the statement that the center cannot hold. I just love the statement. I love the picture that it paints, saying the center cannot hold. He talks about how, all things fly apart. He said, I bet I can actually find the actual comment in the poem. I'm searching in real time. Here it is. It's exactly what he says. The beginning of the poem, he says, turning and turning in the widening gear, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. I won't go read the whole thing, but it's hard to be the center. And you know what? If we're at the center, we're not sufficient. We're not sufficient to be able to hold everything together. It is actually, it's not bad news that we don't belong to ourselves. It's good news. And it'll help us order our world rightly. Jesus Christ was the marvelous and exemplary example. It sounds dumb to say exemplary example. He was the example of living this way of life and this approach, because he did not belong to himself. One of my favorite reflections on that is, and I like Luke's, the way it's worded in Luke, even more, I think, than the other Gospels. In Luke chapter 22, we have the record of Jesus Christ praying to his Father before Passover. Or before it was after Passover. It was during Passover. It was him after the meal, and he instituted new symbols. And he's praying to his Father before they come to arrest him. And in verse 42 of Luke chapter 22, he prays, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. It's important to recognize that here in his limited form, because he had divested himself of many of the divine prerogatives he would normally have as God, and he was very dependent on his Father while he was alive, and knowing that they had a plan, they had a purpose, but also knowing that if he understands things rightly as Jesus Christ, that he's about to get tortured to death. Like anyone else, he'd like to think, hey, I hope there's another way. Hopefully there's some other way to do this. But what did he say? If it's your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He recognized he did not belong to himself. Even if it meant giving up literally everything, he did not belong to himself. I'll probably, in terms of scriptures, wrap up with this one in particular. There's this statement by the Apostle Paul to those in Philippi. And in chapter 2 in Philippians, he tells all of us, so I'll start in verse 3. He says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, which I'll insert and say that is exactly what the world today is saying. You've got to focus on your own interests. But also, Paul says, the interest of others. Right there, he's simply just reflecting how Jesus Christ summarized those parts of the Ten Commandments by saying that love your neighbor as yourself. We already naturally love ourselves, very naturally. He's saying, you know what? You need to give your neighbor the same level of love that you would actually give yourself. He continues to say, why is this really important? In verse 5, he highlights why this is important. Because this mindset, what is it? He says in verse 5, let this mind that he's just discussed, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. It's Christ's mind to think this way. And when we think these thoughts, when we're willing to meditate and commit ourselves to the idea that we don't belong to ourselves, that you don't belong to you, your Instagram feed, guess what? Doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to God. Your Facebook feed doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. Your YouTube channel, or the app you might have on your Apple TV to go watch YouTube, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. The things that belong to you belong to God. Now, does that mean that you have to only watch religious material, on YouTube? Does that mean you can't actually take a selfie to send to your friends? No, it doesn't. But when you recognize that these things belong to God, you treat them differently. There's decisions you make that perhaps you would not make if you recognize that you, your life, and the things that belong to you actually belong to God. But going back to the point, why is it important? Because it's Jesus Christ's own mind. And that means the concept that you don't belong to you, the antidote if you will, to society that is telling you you actually are the center of the whole universe, that mindset is key to actually helping us fulfill our very purpose in life. And what is that purpose? It is to become like Jesus Christ. It is to become like God the Father, not just inwardly, but in toto, to actually become like them and to live in their kind of existence, to actually become real children of God, not just begotten in this life, with his Spirit in us, with God the Father and Jesus Christ living in us to work in us, to help transform us. But eventually at Christ's return, where we see him in the sky and we're rising to meet him in the air, it says right there in 1 John in chapter 3 that we will be like him because we're going to see him the way he is. What does that mean? If we're going to be like him and we see him the way he is, that means we will be like he is when he is shining there in glory. The whole purpose of human existence is to reach that, is to eventually become that. It's not to celebrate who we are and ourselves and to focus on ourselves in this life. It's to focus in a very real and profound way on what we are to become. And so our understanding that we do not belong to ourselves, we are not the highest authority in our lives. If we were to look at our collar or a bracelet or something we had that told others who our owner is, that must say God the Father and Jesus Christ. And I have to warn you, if you look at worldly resources out there, they tend to mingle these things together in such a way that they try to tell you, oh yeah, you belong to Jesus, you belong to Christ. And then they'll turn that into some excuse where you still get to live the way of life you want to live. And you get to focus on the things that are most important to you. But I'm sorry, that's just not the way it works. If you truly belong to someone, then you belong to them. And so I'll wrap up here. We're going to keep it relatively short today, to ask you to please, one, be mindful of the way the culture is influencing you, because it's not always direct. It's just the mere existence of streaming networks, say, on your smart television at home, is part of a larger message that you really are the center of the universe. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking them. I'm glad that I have more choices than I used to have when I was growing up. At the same time, I have to be mindful that the reason I have those is because I am surrounded by a culture that is constantly trying to tell me my opinions are the most important, my judgments are the most accurate, my entertainment choices are clearly the most valuable. So be mindful of what this world is simply broadcasting to you, not even directly telling you, but is broadcasting to you that you are the center of the world. And be ready to counter that with the opposite idea, recognizing I actually don't belong to myself. You don't belong to you, and I don't belong to me. We belong to God the Father and Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who purchased us with his sacrifice. That idea that you don't belong to you is the antidote for the self-centered corruption this world is continually broadcasting to us.
Smith and Robinson.